Hey, guys. Welcome to Building This Community.
This is your city business and policy development podcast. We're your hosts,
Luke Patrick
and Andrew Klump. Welcome to this week's episode of Building This Community. Today is our recap and finale of season 2. So we're going to go through and see and discuss all of our different episodes and maybe key policy takeaways. So maybe go through in order. Luke?
I just wanted to talk about like the things that stood out to us over the course of the season and maybe give you guys an idea of where we stand going forward.
Yeah, so I think it's probably best if we just dive right into that. So first episode, name, image, likeness with Darren Heitner. Talked a lot about different policies that Florida, California, potential congressional movements in that space. That was a very interesting episode because I think that's going to become relevant in Kentucky. It's going to be relevant all across the country here very, very soon. And there was just a Supreme Court hearing. We haven't had the decision yet, but basically both justices, both conservative and liberal, were just destroying the NCAA on not paying their players.
Yeah, I think just based off of the arguments, it seems pretty likely which direction that's going to go.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's something that as a sports crazed state like Kentucky, we're, on the edge of our seats waiting to see what happens with name, image, and likeness. It can so dramatically affect the status of the two major sports teams here in Kentucky, U of L and UK, both football, basketball, everything, and it's great to see that there's movement on that front. And, I think I'm excited to see where it goes.
I think it's going to go beyond name, image, likeness, to be honest. I think it's going to go into full paying players. And I'm not sure I support that. I go back and forth on the payment of players because I think that could really hurt the smaller schools and keep them from being competitive, which I think is a great thing about college athletics. With that said, name, image, likeness, there's zero reason why schools shouldn't be able to, or why players shouldn't be able to make money off their name, image, likeness while they're in college, in addition to getting their scholarship and everything else.
Yeah, and I don't know that you're wrong about the potentially adverse effects on smaller schools, but at the same time, those certain athletes do generate so much revenue for their schools that it's I can easily understand the other arguments that would be made.
Yeah, well, and NIL, it's going to be unequal anyways, right? The bigger schools that are on TV more, those players are going to be making more money through NIL too. So I think it's just that balance, but they may not even get the NCAA may not even get that opportunity. It may just be full-fledged. It has to be a free market, and we'll see where it goes.
It'll be interesting to see what happens there. But what about the Gil Holland community development? What stood out to you there?
So I like that one just because we touched a lot on gentrification in the reaction segment, just to be clear on that. But I think we have to understand, again, how we're being involved in the community, how people want to buy property, want to redevelop areas, and how you integrate the communities that you're moving in towards, because there's a real chance of gentrification just about anywhere you go. But with that said, I think Gil Holland is taking the right approach in most instances. And I think, he's doing rent to own in Portland. And the thing that I'm really excited about is that brewery that he's putting in Harlan that has gotten a lot of news lately. I think that could help revolutionize that part of the state.
I'm really interested to see what goes on with his projects in Portland and, how the face of that neighborhood may change, hopefully for the better in the next few years.
So, but what's a type of policy, though, that you think could be a takeaway? Because one thing that he mentioned is he liked the idea of light rail because it's fixed versus the busing system where even if you put striped lanes down, like bus lanes, those could be taken off tomorrow. But if you're putting actual rail lines down, it's hard to get rid of those.
Yeah. And I mean, we hammered it, I think in the reaction, we hammered it in the interview. It's the whole idea of businesses like stability. They like to have entrenched expectations of what's going to happen in the market in the future. And when you lay down a light rail, that's much more substantial investment, something that is going to be there over time, and like the bus stop, or excuse me, the rail stops are not going to be as fluid as maybe a bus lane. So it does incentivize, I think, some longer term investment.
And I like to use light rail as an example, but it doesn't have, because I want light rail, but it doesn't have to be light rail.
Yeah.
There can just be street changes. I mean, Nulu's looking at right now where they're talking about expanding the sidewalks, having extended curbs and more protected parking, and including more colorful bike lanes. That infrastructure of the sidewalks alone should be enough to sustain business growth. Bardstown Road needs that same type of redevelopment. And I think that really plays into kind of our next discussion with episode 3 with cycling with Melissa and Chris Butler. It all just goes back to street design. Like, are we going to commit ourselves as a city to protecting pedestrians and using that hierarchy?
Yeah, the hierarchy of transportation that we discussed with the Bruntlets, I thought was super interesting. It's something that, like, if you ever sat down and thought about it, maybe it would become apparent. But like, I'd never taken the time. And
what is the hierarchy?
Yeah, so it was pedestrians, cyclists, public transit, and then cars are coming last. You know, and so I think we need a kind of radical reimagining here in America of how we design our cities, at least the central core of a city, to maybe re-emphasize away from cars and towards pedestrians. And it's happening slowly. It's happening in some places across America, in some larger cities, and I'd like to see more of it here in Louisville.
Yeah, and I think those two things go hand in hand. Where you have less cars, you're often seeing better business growth.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, Nulu is extremely walkable. You know, you look at any major city that is the parts of the towns that are extremely walkable is where everybody wants to go. Now, again, you have to be protective of ableism and things like that. You have to be able to allow it to be accessible. And that's where public transit comes in. That's where having handicap accessibility comes in. But to me, we're not going to get to that change of business development unless we have policy affecting our streets.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, I think you talk about ableism. I think, you know, an increase in public transit is something that would only aid, you know, that community. They are not overly reliant, but like, they are definitely a demographic that tends to use public transit maybe at a higher rate than, you know, the average pedestrians and people that don't suffer from any kind of mobility disability. So it's I don't know, it's a good thing, I think, for kind of all parties involved. Yeah,
and I don't know that we're ever going to be this country that eliminates cars or reduces it to a fraction, a tiny fraction of what we currently have, just in part because of the sprawl, in part because of, you know, just the mentality that America has built over the last, you know, 60 years.
Yeah, we're a car-centric country.
Yeah, and I don't know that that's going to change, but it could change in pockets. It could change in urban centers. And I just go back to the same thing, the same argument I always make. Why, as someone who doesn't ride bicycles, why would I not want bike lanes to be throughout the city? Because if I'm driving, I hate getting stuck behind someone on a bike. I want them to have their space and me to have mine. I don't want them in a car either, because that's just one more in the same lane as me. So to me, it makes sense to give them their space.
Yeah.
Because it seems to work better for everybody, but just constantly complaining and fighting over the same space seems to be a non-starter and can't really fix any type of issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like we got to move it on to the discussion with the Boyds. So what stood out to you in talking with the Boyds? If you all don't remember, they managed Dispatches Europe and
in Holland. This is our second straight episode from the Netherlands.
Yeah.
I think they provided something that was really key. And I don't know how the policy would necessarily get formed, but connecting Louisville to international markets seems so integral to developing. And I think that's what they were talking about with Eindhoven, is that they are a smaller market as well, but they have been focusing on kind of what they are good at, which is deep tech.
Yeah, lean into what you do.
Yeah, and using that to connect to the rest of Europe and connect to the United States. And to me, that has got to be the philosophy. And I know Leap has talked about that a little bit, using the rest of the country to get investors. But finding ways into international markets will also give you the opportunity, give the city an opportunity to enter into new industries.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, I think the boys themselves were kind of exploring ways, synergies between Louisville and Eindhoven, and maybe if there are any kind of partnership opportunities by the pre-existing businesses in both places. And that's another one that I'm really interested to see how it develops over the coming years, if they ever come up with anything fruitful, for either place.
Yeah, and I think this is the big thing that I always see is I hear so many local officials all across the country talk about how they want to get big tech or get tech jobs into their city. They want to attract these major companies. We're looking at the state of Kentucky that keeps pushing policies to attract manufacturing facilities, which seem to be probably outdated. That manufacturing is still going to be a big thing, but those jobs are not going to be the forever jobs. Eventually, they will probably be automated.
Yeah, you'll need some, but you don't. I don't know that is the best and most forward-thinking way to go about it.
Yeah, and so right now, but I don't know that local leadership or leadership in general across the country has, at least in these mid-sized cities, known what to push for. And I just go back to the argument of local cities and states need to be going for the satellite office bids. They need to go to major companies and say, hey, locate your HR, locate your tech, locate whatever you can do remotely. Bring that to Louisville. Bring that to whatever mid-sized city you are across the country. Put that here. That should be the competitor. Give the tax breaks to the satellite offices. Even though those may not be the highest end jobs of those companies, you're bringing in mid-level salary jobs.
I think it's an easy pitch to make because there is that benefit on the company, like the cost of living, the cost of housing space, or, of owning office space in a mid-level city like Louisville is so much cheaper. It comes at a premium compared to, owning an office tower in Seattle, New York, LA. I think it's an easy pitch, and it's not one that I've heard made enough.
And it'll be interesting to see, because I do think people are going to start going back to the office at least a little bit. It's going to change, but why do you want to pay, if people are going to be working half remote anyways, why do you want to pay for an office space in New York when you can pay for even smaller space or larger space in Louisville for a fraction of it? But that actually makes me think about our Adam Edlin interview in episode 8. That was we have to get the fiber and internet infrastructure down.
Yeah.
If you get that, the rest of the city and the state can thrive, because if you're at the top level of internet infrastructure, you can do everything remotely. And you can compete on a national and international stage.
Yeah, and I mean, you've said it, that Adam Edlin interview, it went beyond just things that could benefit Louisville. And I think we explored a lot of ways that he personally, through the work he's doing right now with his renewables fund and the different funds that he's involved with, he's pumping all kinds of money and resources into underserved parts of the state, into traditionally neglected parts of the state. And areas that are right now, as we speak, losing investments from a waning coal industry. And so I'm really excited about the future of our state, that we have people like that working on problems that I know affect thousands and thousands of lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it goes to what type of infrastructure do we want to push for? I think renewables make sense. Although you look at the statistics, renewables share of the market space has not grown that much, period. Yeah. It's grown a little bit. It's on a steady incline, but not by a ton. Really, the biggest shift has just been coal and natural gas flipping.
Yes. Yeah, so with coal has advent and increasing market share of fracking as compared to coal.
Yeah, well, then you even have, what is it, the Rice brothers that just sold their fracking company to now buy the two separate companies that will take the gases emanating from garbage dumps.
Yeah, the off gases from landfills.
Yeah, and burn those.
Yeah, to kind of enclose the cycle to kind of you turn it into a means of energy production.
Yeah, if you're going to already be losing all of that gas anyways into the atmosphere, you might as well turn it into energy production.
Yeah.
So it is interesting just to see how that market's changing, but I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be pushing for more renewables, like beyond just like an environmental perspective. I think it just makes sense from an economic perspective.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing. Like you talk about the growth of renewables maybe hasn't been as rapid as you'd like to see, and I think a part of that is maybe the government needs to pour some money into R&D, to pour some money into grants and tax incentives to drive that growth. They've done that with other industries in the past, and it's almost always resulted in an increased market share.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, Adam Eland played into a lot of our previous episodes as well, but I want to go back to then and touch on the Tony Vanetti episode. I know it seems a little out of sorts, but that episode 5, I thought was interesting. It was outside of our wheelhouse a little bit because it wasn't as much of a public policy discussion, but I think there were some really good nuggets in that interview. One, local radio is incredibly important. Like, local radio plays such a vital role, and it has been a dying breed for the past few decades.
And it's like, it's one thing where you see this growth in podcasting, but in the same way that like the consolidation of local TV networks has led to more national stories, I think the podcasting realm has led to people maybe spending more time listening to more national stories or stories of less local emphasis.
Well, people that run podcasts want to go national. They don't want to, they don't want to just have the local.
Yeah. But that has led to almost a void where local radio used to occupy this massive space in people's lives and have a big impact on, news coverage of like local government and like local events. And I'm glad to hear that there are still people doing it that are successful at it. And it's something that I don't want to see go away.
Yeah. And hopefully there can be a resurgence of that. We'll see. And again, the best form of getting your news is still written journalism.
Yeah.
And so it's good to see. I mean, the Courier Journal has honestly been on fire lately with their coverage. They've been very, very spot on. So it is good to see our growth in that regard. But the local radio is a bit concerning. What do you think about episode 6 with the green spaces impact on health with Ted Smith?
It still fascinates me, some of the hypotheses they took into the study that's currently ongoing. And again, it's one of those things, it's just a wait and see. We've got to see how the study comes out, how it shakes out. But it is really, really interesting stuff. Dr. Smith was one of the most prepared guests we've ever had, it shouldn't come as a surprise, but I was really excited to talk to him. I was excited to hear about like the entire team. Like it seems like a massive effort to coordinate so many people to, monitor like the results. You need doctors to like analyze like all of the
clinical. And to be clear, like the whole point of it's a study to where it's going to see the impact of planting trees and adding green space in one neighborhood as opposed to a similar situated neighborhood that doesn't
like a controlled neighborhood that doesn't have that same kind of so like and I guess like what sets that apart from previous studies is there have been studies about the impact of green spaces on health conducted before, but not really a study where you take a place that doesn't have much green space and you add it. I think they were most of the other studies that have come before it have relied on existing green space versus like this new element of like actually altering the environment.
Well, and that hasn't happened because it's expensive. Right.
Yeah, there's a massive cost.
And so what they've done is they compare a space of town that doesn't have green space to a space of town that does have green space. Well, that's also comparing wealth versus poverty.
Yeah,
to a certain degree. And people in poverty are going to have worse health outcomes. Now that in part can be a different discussion on a whole variety of factors. But I think it's important to delineate that and say, okay, well, we're going to take 2 areas of town that have this similar economics,
Yeah.
and see what the green space difference is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it took, he talked about the effort of trying to coordinate multiple agencies, that might be able to fund one part of the study, but didn't want to fund another, and, another that was going to fund, the other part, but not the first. And it was a really impressive effort to try and coordinate all of the different people and organizations, agencies that have a say in this study. And, it's impressive work that they're doing.
Well, and the last thing that I'll say about that is what Dr. Chad Smith said that was so great to me is that no matter what the results of the study are, we can still find a way to make sure that trees and green space need to be added. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter.
That was, I think, more us, and he certainly, I think, would love to see that. But we were definitely pushing that in the reaction.
Yeah, fair. But the whole point is, right, that even if it says there's no impact on health,
yes,
there can still be reasons to add green space.
Yeah, and that also, I don't know that we even talked about it in the interview or the reaction, but I think people that read white papers, people that read studies or professors, there is, I think, an overemphasis on studies that do have like a positive result. Mm-hmm. Whereas like a study with like no correlation, no, a finding of no impact, it can be just as influential, be
absolutely
just as important a study to conduct, And so I don't know. I think the work they're doing is impressive, and I'm excited to see what.
Well, we already know that there are some things that trees can do. So, for example, when you have tall trees in the middle of streets or on the edge of streets, people drive slower because it feels more enclosed. When buildings are up close, the streets feel narrow and people slow down. So there are so many different impacts. This is purely on health. So even if there's no health impact, we can look at different ways to require green spaces to be added to our lives.
Yeah.
What'd you think of the startup with LEAP, Louisville Entrepreneurial Acceleration Partnership, or programs now with Will Metcalf?
Well, no, it was great once we got the name down.
Yeah. They're in the process of changing it. So.
Yeah. It wasn't all on us. But no, it's, again, and we've talked about accelerators and co-working spaces and different methods for new businesses to kind of find networking opportunities and find mentorships. And, that is the type of work that I love to see done in Louisville. Mm-hmm. I like to see a part of them kind of leaning into like the healthcare space, but also like now branching out to like more generalized work. And I think that goes into kind of what the Boyds were talking about, leaning into what your city does well. We've got a lot of healthcare businesses, healthcare related industries in the city. And so it makes a lot of sense to try and provide accelerators specifically for that type of business. And I'm glad to see that kind of work being done here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the important thing, right? Lean into what we are good at. Yep. That doesn't mean that we should be ignoring other industries, which is why it's so good that they've had their own spinoff called Amplify Louisville.
Yes.
For all general startups. And so it's good to maybe they can cross use their resources at some point, but it's good that we have a focus on what we're good at to try and push that and grow that. And honestly, you've got to get investors outside the city if you want to grow. Like, it's been long overdue for Louisville to look to other cities and see, how do we cooperate? How do we collaborate? And how do we build our businesses better because of it? Because there's just not enough resources in one city. And that's true for most mid-sized cities. To be honest, they need to collaborate with others. We talk about this all the time. Cincinnati works a lot with Boston for as far as like financials go. So like, investing is not a city oriented process.
Yeah, it can be regional. It can be even
national.
Larger,
it can be international.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what Terry and Cheryl Boyd were talking about. They want to connect investors in Louisville with businesses in Eindhoven.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the level of expansive viewership and thought-provokingness that's needed to grow our startup community.
Absolutely. So moving on to our discussion about bourbon and bourbonism and women's role in it. What did you take away from our talk with Maggie?
So one, I'm glad she kind of reiterated what Albrecht Sommer, when we talked to him in season 1, about bourbon that basically it is growing rapidly, and we might have competition outside the state of Kentucky for it, but no one's really worried about that at the moment. But with that said, it's going to keep growing from a consumer base, but it's never going to have that black market cost of Scotch because of the aging process. Like, it's never going to hit those individualized skyrocketing prices that Scotch has.
Yeah, that was interesting, and I like bourbon a lot. It's my main drink of choice, but that was something that I'd never thought about, and I felt like I understood at least like the aging process and like what went into making bourbon, but it's just something I'd never thought of, and it was kind of an interesting take. I really liked also her challenging even my understanding of like women's role in the bourbon industry and like brewing and distilling generally, and it's always nice to have people emphasize the role that women, or it can be anything, minority groups have played in industries that has often been whitewashed away or covered up by men who have for many years have taken like center stage when it's not necessarily that they're driving the industry even.
Well, and I think that's something that hopefully we can get into the discussion later in the future seasons, and like just making sure we understand why and how the roles of different minority groups throughout businesses, like general industries, what they are, and why that is starting to have more of a prominence now. And it's important that people and companies are finally starting to look into their own history and being a little more authentic with how it truly was developed.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we talked at the episode, like another thing that comes to mind is like the contribution of African Americans to the horse racing industry in Kentucky, which is just, it's a conversation that needs to happen, and it's something that I don't think enough people maybe know about. But it's inarguable, that like we would not be the horse racing state that we are without the contributions made by that community.
Yeah.
And I mean, like the same thing is happening today with like the Latin American community. It's like some of the best trainers in the world, some of the best, breeders in the world are, Latin American, from Latin America, and they chose to live here in Kentucky, and they're changing the face of horse racing as we speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and then the last episode that we just dropped was episode 10 with Metro Council President David James, who's running for mayor. What did you think about that interview?
Well, I thought that was an awesome guest to get. I was super excited to get the chance to talk to him. You can probably speak much more articulately on this than me, but it was the role that Metro Council plays as opposed to the mayor, and like the emphasis on the executive branch at the local level.
Yeah. So in Louisville or in Kentucky, and that's part of the way that the framing is, the state legislature has made it. The mayor is the one that has the control of literally everything.
Yeah.
And the Metro Council, all they really get control over is the budget. And ultimately, the people that keep the mayor accountable is the Metro Council a little bit because of the budget, but it's the media. It's literally the local media that keeps the mayor as accountable as anybody else. So, for example, when Metro Council passes a particular budget, they only get these broad categories. They don't get to decide each individual spend and the flexibility between items that the mayor gets to do. And the mayor's the one that makes the budget. The mayor's the one that presents the budget to the council. So it is very difficult for Metro Council to have that. Now people could suggest changing to maybe a commissioner style government where it's basically where everyone's a commissioner. You would have a commissioner president, and each commissioner would have some administrative or executive role in a particular area. Maybe some would be street paving, others would be waste management, or whatever it would be. Some would be policing, and you could do it that way. Or a simpler way would be just to have the state allow and give more flexibility and power to the Metro Council, give that legislature more authority. And so it could be something as simple as, and this isn't technically the Metro Council, but, like the Civilian Review Board that has just formed, they're not getting subpoena power. Yeah. And so these arms to these chances to put constraints on the executive are just not there.
Yeah.
And it's that the city and all cities throughout the state are being handcuffed a little bit because of the state not allowing a full fulfillment of the legislature to take some of its power back. It just was formed with the executive having more control.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I honestly liked the discussion of Councilman James' potential policies he'd like to see if he were to win the race for mayor. And I think another one that we just kind of have to wait and see. It'll be interesting to see if he does end up winning, how much his legacy will match what he hoped his legacy would be when we talked about it on the show.
Yeah. And I think the one thing he talked about that I thought was interesting was the urban development. I am curious, and I know we said that in the reaction segment to that episode. I just don't know. I don't think people realize that Metro Council people, Metro government, when they don't own the properties, it's so hard for them to be like, hey, you know, it would be great in this neighborhood, a grocery store. But to get the private property owner to sell to a developer, to connect the developer with the private property owner, and they both have the same idea in mind and making it work, that is just so difficult to do because the private property owner is trying to make a buck. They're trying to sell for whatever probably the best price they can get. And if they're going to sell it to a storage locker company rather than selling it to a grocery store in an area that needs a grocery store, guess who they're probably going to sell it to? The only way that they can prevent that might be from zoning changes or things like that. But it's just so hard for Metro government to say, hey, we need this on a private piece of private land. Go fix it. And they can't do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The last thing that kind of stood out to me there was like our discussion of policing and the relationship that our city has with its police force, or I guess police forces, because there are, multiple different jurisdictions within Jefferson County. But it's a tense subject, to say the least, and I'd like to see whatever, Metro Council, but, even the mayors, anybody involved in government, I'd like to see whatever they can do to try and improve that relationship. I'd like to see it take place because right now it is unbelievably strained. Doesn't really show many signs of getting better. And it's not an easy solution that I think you can present, but, I'm open to all new ideas. And I think it's something we need to see changed.
Well, and that's what I think part of our whole purpose of this podcast is, we've been doing this for 8 months now. We've had 2 seasons come and go. And I just want to take this time just to reflect a little bit on this. And I think the whole point of this is to continue to spur ideas, try and take what we can from our local leaders, take what we can from our leaders outside throughout the country, throughout the world, and see what policy ideas we can do to help make this city better. And ultimately, I think we're getting there with this podcast. We're trying to inform people, but I think we need to find a way to engage and make sure that people are understanding what this podcast is trying to do. And we need feedback. We need to hear from our listeners and tell us, hey, I like this idea, this concept. You should talk about it on your episode. We need to start engaging and working with our listeners better.
Yeah. If you all have ideas for people you'd like to see us talk to or ideas you'd like to see discussed, reach out. Yeah. Hit us up on our Twitter, send us an email. Absolutely. Like we are welcome to any kind of input. I think also going forward, season 3, we're going to start working on that guest list here soon. We're going to take a little time off, a month, maybe a little bit longer. We might drop a, preview episode to buy some extra time. Yeah. But we're ready to get down here soon and start planning out our next season. We look forward to talking to you guys in, a month or so.
Yeah. And check us out on Twitter. I know we always have that in our exit. But then also feel free to reach out to us via email too at buildingthiscommunity@gmail.com. Yeah. So thanks for 2 awesome seasons, guys. We'll be back to you soon.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, guys. As always, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us on Building This Community. If you'd like any more information, you can follow us on Twitter at BuildingThisCom, COM, or you can follow Andrew
at Andrew J. Klump. And you can also follow Luke
at LMP43. Definitely subscribe, and we look forward to talking to you guys next week.